I think that there are three kinds of people in this world when it comes to Bigfoot. You got people that you could lay a body down in front of them, they're never gonna believe it. Then you have the knowers. You have people like me and like the guys that I go with when we do this. We know Bigfoot exists. There's no doubt in our mind.
From chilling sightings deep in the unmapped forests of the Pacific Northwest to heart-stopping encounters that shake even the toughest skeptics, these are the stories that may finally prove Bigfoot is real. Picture the towering trees of the Pacific Northwest, reaching skyward in dense, almost suffocating clusters, their thick canopies stretching far overhead. Light barely seeps through, casting long, ghostly shadows that shift with every gust of wind. The forest is old, ancient even, and you can feel its history in the damp earth beneath your feet. For centuries, tales have emerged from these very woods, tales of an elusive creature that stalks the shadows. Known by many names, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the Beast, its legend has captivated the imaginations of believers and skeptics alike. While many dismiss these stories as folklore, one encounter may finally provide the evidence the world has been waiting for. Our story centers on a seasoned hiker and outdoorsman, someone deeply connected to the wilderness.
One will be killed, undoubtedly. Some logger will roll one over on the way to work in the morning in his truck or something like that. Some testosterone-starved hunter will bring one down and think he's the man or whatever.
For years, he'd trekked through these forests, navigating trails few dared to follow and camping alone in remote areas, absorbing the quiet power of the land. But on this particular journey, he would find himself face to face with something far beyond his understanding. The morning of discovery. It was a typical misty morning in early spring. The air was heavy, almost thick, as a light drizzle cast a shimmering film over the forest floor. Our hiker set out early, prepared for a day of exploring lesser-known trails. Every step he took seemed amplified in the stillness, the crunch of twigs and leaves beneath his boots echoing through the trees. The forest was alive with the subtle sounds of nature, the rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, the occasional crack of a branch. But as he moved deeper into the heart of the forest, something changed. A peculiar stillness seemed to settle over the woods, silencing the usual background of wildlife. It was as though he had crossed an invisible boundary. Every sound he made felt louder, more intrusive, and a chill ran down his spine. The further he walked, the stranger the forest felt, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. The first sign, an unusual footprint. Then, something unusual caught his eye. In a small patch of damp earth, barely noticeable at first, was a footprint. Not just any footprint, though. This one was enormous, over 18 inches long, with toes splayed clearly in the mud. The print was human-like but far too large, and the depth of the impression suggested that whatever left it was incredibly heavy.
Aside from finding a dead Bigfoot, is to obtain that kind of physical evidence, where at least from the DNA sequencing or perhaps from...
He kneeled, his fingers tracing the outline, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and dread. The size alone defied explanation. He knew the tracks of the forest's common inhabitants well, and this was nothing like a bear or any other known animal. It was as if a giant had walked through the mud, leaving its mark. For a moment, he considered the possibility of a prank, but the print was too detailed, too precise to be fabricated. And if it was real, then what could possibly have left it? As he examined the footprint, he noticed something else. Faint traces of a trail leading away from it, as if whatever had made the print was moving deeper into the woods. He felt a tug of curiosity, a pull that urged him to follow, despite the creeping fear growing inside him. An overpowering smell. As he went along the faint trail, something unusual filled the air. A strong, musky smell, almost like wet fur mixed with something else he couldn't identify. It was unlike anything he'd encountered before, and he'd been around plenty of wild animals. The smell grew stronger, more pungent, clinging to the air as if it had been there for a long time. His stomach turned as he breathed it in, and a feeling of unease settled over him. The scent seemed to mark a path of its own, leading him further off the beaten trail and deeper into the heart of the forest. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something's territory, that he was no longer alone. A disturbing silence. As he moved forward, the forest grew quiet, unnaturally so. The usual background hum of insects, birds, and rustling leaves faded into an eerie silence. It was as if every creature had sensed something and decided to hide. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, amplifying his own footsteps until they sounded like thunder.
He walked right up on one. Him thinking that they were there earlier than he was not entirely correct. They were watching him, and they were waiting for him to leave.
His breathing grew shallow, each exhale feeling louder than the last. For a moment, he considered turning back. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to abandon this strange pursuit and return to familiar ground. But something kept him moving forward. A sense of curiosity, a need to understand. He reminded himself that he was an experienced outdoorsman, that he'd faced countless challenges in the wilderness. Yet there was a lingering feeling of vulnerability, a sense that this time he might be dealing with something far beyond his control. A glimpse of the creature, then he heard it. A low guttural sound echoed from somewhere ahead, vibrating through the air with a force that sent chills down his spine. He stopped, his heart pounding, and strained his ears, trying to locate the source. The sound was like a growl, deep and resonant, coming from a creature larger than anything he'd encountered in these woods. He took a tentative step forward, barely breathing, his eyes scanning the dense foliage. And then, through the trees, he saw it. A massive figure standing still, partially hidden by the fog. It was tall, towering at least 8 feet, and broad-shouldered, with long arms that hung low. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows. But the most striking feature was its eyes. Dark, intelligent, and watching him with a keen awareness that was unmistakable. The two of them stood frozen, locked in a silent stare, each observing the other. He could feel the creature's gaze piercing through him, a weight that seemed to press down on his very soul. In that moment, he felt a sense of awe mixed with an overwhelming fear. This was no mere animal. This was something more. The stories, the legends, all of them flashed through his mind, each one now carrying a chilling ring of truth, an unspoken warning. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound beyond that initial growl. It simply stood there, watching him, its expression unreadable, but filled with a depth that seemed almost human. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and melted back into the fog, disappearing into the forest as if it had never been there at all.
Researchers who take Bigfoot seriously don't take every alleged Bigfoot video seriously. In fact, they're often the first to call foul on the fakers. So when they tell us they've seen video they think is legit.
The hiker was left standing alone, his heart racing, his mind struggling to process what he'd just seen. The forest around him remained silent, the eerie stillness pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He knew he should turn back, that he had already seen enough, but something inside him refused to let go. This was more than just an encounter. It felt like a message, a warning perhaps, or an invitation to dive deeper. An irresistible pull. Despite the fear eating at him, he felt an unshakable urge to follow, to see where the creature had gone. His heart pounded as he took a hesitant step forward, his body tense, ready to turn and run if necessary. But the forest, now silent and foreboding, seemed to open up before him, as though it were calling him further into its depths. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, his legs trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. He was no longer sure if he was searching for the creature or if it was leading him somewhere. The footprints continued, faint but unmistakable, guiding him into the unknown. A path marked by mystery. As he followed the trail deeper into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was venturing into a realm far removed from the ordinary world. Each footprint was like a marker, pulling him onward with a magnetic force he couldn't explain. The prints weren't erratic or haphazard. They followed a path that seemed deliberate, like the creature was moving with purpose, leading him to somewhere. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the forest became. The shadows grew longer, darker, stretching like skeletal fingers over the ground. The trees loomed larger, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. He felt the weight of the forest pressing down on him, as though he was trespassing in a forbidden place. a place that humans weren't meant to see. Strange signs along the way. As he continued, he noticed strange things. Trees with twisted, broken branches stood at intervals, marking the path in a way that felt intentional. Some branches were bent at unnatural angles, too high up to have been broken by human hands. Others had fresh claw marks etched deep into their bark, like silent warnings from an unseen creature. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees. It was a maze of cryptic signs, each one adding to the mounting tension in the air. Occasionally he'd stop, looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see the creature watching him. He could feel its presence, lurking just beyond his line of sight, hidden in the dense underbrush. He'd catch glimpses of movement, shadows flickering between the trees, but every time he turned to look, there was nothing. The silence was thick, oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional creak of a branch or the distant rustling of leaves. He felt like he was being watched, yet he was entirely alone. A smell unlike any other. The musky odor he had detected earlier grew stronger as he went further. It was a pungent smell, thick and cloying, like the stench of wet fur mixed with something sour.
In Florida, they have something called the skunk ape, and there's been a lot of sightings over many years of what they describe as a Bigfoot type of creature. What they call that is the skunk ape, partly because it smells skunky.
The scent clung to the air, filling his nostrils and making his stomach churn. It was a smell that seemed to come from the very trees around him, soaking into the earth itself. He couldn't place it, but it was unlike any animal scent he'd encountered before. As he walked, the smell seemed to intensify, creating a nauseating atmosphere that hung like a shroud over the forest. He felt as though he was walking into the creature's lair, a space where it had made its home, marking it with its scent as a declaration of ownership. This was no longer a simple hike through the woods. It was an intrusion into another being's territory. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he couldn't. Something beyond reason was urging him forward, discovering strange markings. Then he noticed something strange etched into the trunks of several trees, symbols or patterns, deeply scratched into the bark. The shapes were crude yet deliberate, resembling no natural markings he could identify. Some looked like claw marks, but they were too precise, too uniform to be the work of an animal in passing. It was as if the creature had created these marks as a message, a form of communication that defied human understanding. He ran his fingers over one of the carvings, feeling the rough edges where bark had been stripped away. The grooves were deep, as though made by claws far sharper and stronger than any he'd ever seen. The forest felt even more alive, like it was aware of his presence and the path he was taking. These signs only heightened his sense of trespassing, as if he had stumbled into a place meant for no human eyes. The cabin in the clearing. After what felt like hours of walking, he came upon a small clearing. At its center stood an old abandoned cabin, half hidden by dense foliage. The cabin looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The windows were broken, and the roof sagged under the weight of creeping vines. It was as though the forest itself was swallowing the structure, reclaiming it piece by piece. A strange sense of unease washed over him as he approached. This cabin felt out of place, yet perfectly aligned with the eerie atmosphere around him. The closer he got, the more he felt like he was being drawn into a trap, as if the cabin was bait, placed there to lure him deeper into the forest's mysteries. He hesitated, every nerve on edge, but curiosity pushed him forward. This wasn't just an old building in the woods. There was something more to it, a hidden purpose that he couldn't quite grasp.
There are a number of pieces of video footage, although a little more low-res, that also pass muster. The Freeman footage, the Memorial Day footage. There's other ones also. And to say there's never been, video or film of these things.
He carefully approached the creaking front steps, his boots sinking slightly into the rotting wood. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence, the creak of the boards loud enough to make him flinch. He took a deep breath, bracing himself, and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was dark and cold, with only faint shafts of light filtering through cracks in the walls. The air was stale, thick with the smell of decay and mildew, and his every breath felt heavy. The room was empty except for a few scattered objects. In one corner, he saw an old, weathered notebook, its cover faded and peeling. Nearby lay a pair of binoculars, dusty and covered in cobwebs, as if they hadn't been touched in decades. And in the center of the floor was a pair of large boots, abandoned but eerily intact. His heart pounded as he moved closer, feeling as though he was intruding on something private, something sacred. The notebook and its secrets. With trembling hands, he picked up the notebook, brushing off the dust to reveal its contents. Inside were pages filled with sketches, notes, and cryptic warnings. The drawings depicted a creature similar to what he had seen, a massive figure, standing tall and covered in dark fur. Some sketches showed footprints, strikingly similar to the ones he'd found in the mud. There were notes, brief but chilling, describing sightings, strange sounds, and warnings to stay away. One entry in particular caught his attention. It read, "The guardian of the forest watches all who enter. Do not follow. Leave this place while you can." A shiver ran down his spine as he read the words. Whoever had written them had clearly experienced the same presence he was feeling now. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was something bigger, something that went beyond simple curiosity. The notebook felt like a message from the past, a reminder that he was not the first to walk this path, and perhaps he wouldn't be the last. But unlike those who had left these notes, he was determined to see this through, to uncover the truth, no matter the risk. A sudden presence outside. As he flipped through the pages, a noise outside snapped him back to reality. Heavy footsteps echoed from beyond the cabin, slow and deliberate, as if something was circling the structure. His heart raced, his mind flashing with images of the creature he had glimpsed earlier. He turned off his flashlight, crouching low, barely daring to breathe as he listened.
Kind of like this. But so much lower than that. Okay? And it was right at this spot. Like I knew it was coming right from this direction.
The footsteps grew louder, each one sending vibrations through the floorboards. He moved cautiously to the window, peering through a crack in the wood. In the moonlight, he could see a massive figure just outside, its silhouette unmistakable. It stood there, unmoving, as though waiting, watching the cabin with a predatory gaze. His hands trembled, and for the first time he felt the true weight of his actions. He was no longer an observer. He was part of the creature's world now, and it knew he was here. An overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The realization hit him with crushing clarity. He was utterly vulnerable. The creature was outside, and he had no way out. His pulse raced as he pressed his back against the wall, trying to calm his breathing, but fear had already taken hold. In that moment, he understood why so few people ever returned from encounters like this. Bigfoot wasn't just a creature, it was the guardian of these woods, a being of intelligence and power that defied understanding. A face-to-face encounter. The footsteps outside stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The hiker was paralyzed, his back pressed against the cabin wall, his breath shallow. The air felt thick, charged with tension, as if even the forest was holding its breath. He knew that if he moved, if he made the slightest sound, he would give away his presence. Peering through the cracked window, he saw the creature standing mere yards away. The sight was even more terrifying up close. In the dim light, he could make out the creature's massive frame, its thick fur matted and dark. It stood upright, its shoulders broad, and its arms hung low, nearly reaching its knees. It looked every bit as formidable as the legends described, and yet there was something about it that seemed almost calm, as though it was observing him as much as he was observing it. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, each beat loud enough that he worried the creature might hear it. They locked eyes for a moment, and he felt a chill run through him, as if the creature's gaze was seeing into his soul. It wasn't the empty stare of a wild animal. It was intelligent, almost human. It held an understanding, a knowledge, as though it knew he was there to seek answers. A silent understanding. They stood there, man and creature, separated by mere feet and a thin wooden wall. He felt a strange connection, an understanding that went beyond words.
Up out there was just this guy about that long, just a skinny little hair. It was kind of amberish in color and really kind of distinct, and it looked just like some hairs that Bobo had actually shown me a couple years prior of some suspected Sasquatch hairs. So
This creature was no mere beast. It was something ancient, something far more aware than any other animal he had encountered. The realization dawned on him that he was not dealing with a simple cryptid or myth. He was in the presence of a guardian, a keeper of the forest that had been here long before humanity claimed dominion over these lands. Then, in a swift motion, the creature turned, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for its size. It walked back into the trees, its form blending into the darkness as if it were a part of the forest itself. The hiker watched, captivated, as it disappeared into the shadows, leaving him standing alone in the cabin. The silence that followed was heavy, almost deafening, and he felt an overwhelming urge to follow. He stepped outside looking around, but the creature was gone. Only the faintest trace of its musky scent lingered in the air, a reminder that it had been there, that what he had seen was real. He looked down at the ground, noticing fresh footprints leading back into the forest. They were large, unmistakable, and he knew that they were his invitation to continue. The creature was leading him somewhere, guiding him deeper into its world, as though it had decided to share something with him. Following the footprints. With his heart pounding, he followed the trail. Every step took him further from the familiar, deeper into the unknown. The forest felt different now, less foreboding, more alive, as though it was welcoming him into its secrets. The trees seemed to part before him, their branches swaying gently in a non-existent breeze. He felt a strange sense of peace, a feeling that he was meant to be here, that this path was leading him to something important.
Only humans have the apparatus for language like we have. That separates us from all the other animals in the kingdom of this earth. If they have the vocal mechanism for language, maybe they're got some human component to them.
The footprints wound through the trees, crossing streams and climbing ridges. The forest grew darker, denser, the canopy above blocking out what little light remained. He moved carefully, his flashlight guiding his way, though he felt as if the forest itself was lighting his path. It was as though he had entered a different world, a place where time moved differently, where the rules of nature didn't apply. After following the trail for what felt like hours, he saw the creature again. It was standing at the edge of a clearing, its back turned to him as if waiting. He stopped, watching in silence, not wanting to break the spell of the moment. The creature turned slowly, meeting his gaze with that same piercing look. He felt a surge of awe, a realization that this was more than just an encounter. This was a moment of trust, a shared experience between two beings from vastly different worlds. A new mission, conservation and respect. The encounter had planted a seed within him, a desire to protect and preserve the wilderness. He began volunteering with conservation groups, speaking about the importance of respecting natural habitats, not for the sake of Bigfoot alone, but for the countless species that called the forest home. He saw the forest now, not just as a landscape, but as a living, breathing entity, a sanctuary that needed guardianship. When he shared his message, he spoke not of monsters or myths, but of the need to protect wild spaces, to honor the mysteries that lay within them. His encounter with Bigfoot became his motivation, a quiet force driving him to make a difference, to ensure that future generations could experience the wonder of the natural world. He knew he might never encounter the creature again, but that wasn't the point. The point was to respect and protect the land that the creature called home.